Hello again, and welcome to another edition of Public Affairs Public Access. I'm your host, David Hutzelman, and on my show we normally talk about issues of political philosophy and public policy that have a libertarian perspective to them. And tonight is no exception. And tonight we're going to be talking with a guest that I've had on the show before. And it's a very knowledgeable discussion that he's going to give us about the issues of democracy and the republic and the difference between the two. But I'm often asked, what is a libertarian perspective anyway? And just to bring us up to all the same level of understanding, libertarians are generally folks that support a free market economy, not the over-regulated crony capitalistic economy that we've evolved into today, and have a strong respect for civil liberties and the ability of people to manage their own affairs as long as they don't harm anyone else and take their own choice of personal lifestyles. And also a usually pretty skeptical view of foreign policy in that the United States has not been chartered as a world force to go and make the world safe for democracy like we might be talking about tonight, because it's usually winds up with some very bad consequences. Now that's a political view of libertarians, and of course some libertarians don't even want to participate in politics because they're basically issues of they believe that you should never use force or fraud, initiate force or fraud against anyone else, and therefore they think that voting is somehow using the power of government to suppress other peaceful people. And I guess we have to also remember that libertarianism is not a end-all be-all philosophy. It's strictly a political philosophy. It doesn't tell you how to live a good life or how to be a good person or what values you ought to have in your personal life. Other spheres of influence, religion, education, other things are perfectly adequate for that. We're basically concerned with the relationship of the individual to the government and to other people from a legal standpoint. So joining me tonight, I have my guest is Carl Jarvis. Carl's been on the show before. He's an author of a best-selling book, The United States of Dysfunction, and he is working on a new book that he'll probably tell us a little bit about. He's a graduate of RPI. He's got a degree in mathematics, and he's a past naval officer on a nuclear-powered carrier. He has also been a candidate for District C in the Houston City Council elections of last year. So welcome to the show, Carl.
Thank you for having me, David.
Okay, well, great. Well, to kick the show off on a somewhat abstract and historical basis, tonight we're going to be talking about the differences and tensions maybe between two political terms, democracy and republic. And Carl, his first book, has delved into some of those issues already. But if we want to set it up historically, I guess we have to go all the way back to Greece, 300 to 500 BC, to find out where those two terms originated. You have Pericles and the Athenian democracy, which is the first known city-state democracy in Greece and in the known world at that time, I guess. And also, of course, you have Socrates and Plato's Republic, which is an expose on what government and political power, how it should be arranged within a society, and who does what and how that should function. So, Carl, let me turn it over to you and ask you if there's anything that the Greeks have anything prescient to say about what our situation is today between democracy and republic.
Well, there's so many different ways that we could go from the Greek example. Certainly, if you look at Plato's Republic, it claims that it's putting forth this ideal of a republic, but if you actually read what Plato was advocating, it's this sort of almost a totalitarian, what we would term today a totalitarian political order.
Philosopher kings like our
Philosopher
president,
kings
right?
running everything. Certainly a lot of attributes that we would associate with communist or socialist countries, with very rigid class structures, very rigid economy. And this is in contrast. Plato was really a reaction against the so-called Athenian democracy, which, even to call it the Athenian democracy a democracy wasn't really true, given the very few people that were able to participate in that right to vote.
Yeah, I think there's only about a third of the population of Athens.
It may have even been less than that. There were so many requirements in order to participate in that. And of course, it was also a direct democracy in the sense that all the citizens assembled in order to pass and deliberate on any law. So it was a very different system, and certainly it was a system that the founding fathers of our country looked at with great caution, the same as they looked at Plato's ideas with great caution, because neither one of these ideals or ways of government was seen as practical for our country.
Well, it seems that as a Austrian economist and historian that I read sometimes, that has a book called Democracy, the God That Failed, it appears that the American public's appetite for democracy might be waning in light of the current presidential election.
Well, the current presidential election is really sort of an encapsulation of the fruits of democracy, if you will, because you have, at the one hand, this massive dissatisfaction with the process and with the results of the process. I mean, you look at it, 40% of the Democratic Party doesn't want to support their nominee. More than 40% of the Republican Party doesn't want to support Trump, who's the presumptive nominee there. And so you start to ask, well, how did we get into a situation where neither of the party's nominees, even though we have this democratic process, neither one of the party's nominees are being supported by, if you want to call it the mainstream or the most of the people that affiliate with those parties? How did we get into a situation where so many people disapprove? There was a Gallup poll released in the last 6 months showing that 42% of the folks that were polled disapprove of the process that we use to select the nominees for each party. So how did we get into this situation where we have a process that people don't like, we have the results of that process that people don't like, and yet we're continuing not just to use that process, but we hear very few challenges to the overall thrust and effect? In other words, how do we actually get back to the basics and fix this system that we're using to select these candidates?
Well, your first book, The U.S. of Dysfunction, certainly treated that as the main theme of the whole book, and you had some prescriptions about how we might return to a more, I guess, call it an informed method or system of democracy than certainly than the direct primary and people with large amounts of money and lobbying supports controlling basically the selection of candidates, and money being a very big barrier to anybody even thinking about entering a national political race. So I'm wondering, is that theme in your earlier book one that you intend to build on in your next book?
It is, but really at a more general level. I mean, I think that there's some general principles here that are being overlooked, and hence the theme of our show tonight, democracy versus republic. What is a democracy? What is a republic? And if you really kind of distill down what a democracy is, and certainly you don't have to go too far to find folks that advocate this and know in certain terms. They want a democracy where the leader, the chief executive of the country, is elected by one giant, massive pool of votes that are gathered around from the entire country. Forget about state boundaries, forget about county boundaries, even for the purposes of breaking up that vote into different parts and sections. They want everything done in one national vote. And that's in contrast with what the Founding Fathers intended with institutions like the Electoral College, where they really wanted to divide that process up. They wanted to impose a structure on it, and out of that structure, they wanted to make that process more orderly than it would be if you just sort of rolled the dice and cast it into this massive ocean of millions and millions of votes, which, oh, by the way, is where you get all the influence and money from. And I know that there's a lot of folks that believe in democracy and also are very much opposed to the role that money plays in our elections today. And the thing is, when you look at what democracy is, certainly the way that they advocate it and the way that they talk about it, which is often majority rule, one person, one vote, no boundaries, no structures, no representative system within that process, what you end up with is a system where money rules the day, money controls the outcome of elections, because you need money to reach those millions of voters that are then pooled into this huge election process. And I would submit that anyone who believes in democracy, that's probably what we need to get away from if we want our system to be more democratic in effect.
Yeah, of course, we could look back to Woodrow Wilson for our foreign policy that we're trying to make the world safe for democracy. So we're encouraging other people to adopt the same kind of system that we have, you know, one person, one vote, some system where the person that's basically in charge of the media or distribution system is the person that gets to get their face in front of the voters the most often.
Well, and let's talk about the concept of one person, one vote for a second too, because that's certainly been a theme in the federal courts since the 60s. You know, they want to ensure the right to vote. They want to ensure that this principle of one person, one vote is upheld. But it's very interesting if you look at a lot of their election law rulings, certainly when it comes to legislative redistricting. At the same time that they've pushed for this principle of one person, one vote, they've also created a process and a standard that allows lawmakers to gerrymander the districts so much that even though everyone gets one person and one vote, and all the districts have almost exactly equal population because that's the standard that they enforce, you can never actually remove any of the incumbents from office because they enforce that standard so exclusively that they don't look at competing issues or competing factors for what would actually enable democracy to take effect.
Yeah, it's interesting we can have one person, one vote nationally, but on a state-by-state basis, it's not
They don't
one
allow
person,
it.
one vote.
Right.
You know, it's all, like you say, gerrymandered down to support, I'm not sure what, whatever the current view of giving voices to different groups that are and can be politically powerful
Certainly.
in an election process. So, yeah, very interesting. So, well, I know in your first book you talked about driving some political decision making away from these large winner-take-all, big spending elections where everybody gets to vote for one candidate, back to a more grounded space with the actual people who are playing roles within the political process, which of course then drives it back to party structures, Democrats and Republicans, and how they can regain their individual power as opposed to having the issue of direct primaries. And going back to our theme of democracy versus republics, It was pointed out to me recently, I don't know why it took me so long to get the point, but by Randy Barnett, who is a law professor at Georgetown University, talking about the difference between Democrats and Republicans. Here we again have democracy and republic. And he was saying that it really goes back to a difference of opinion in the way these two parties think about, for instance, the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, where it says, "We the people." I mean, everybody agrees that we the people are in charge. The government is our servant, and we should be in charge. Now, if you look at we the people as a force of groups that can change things, then you kind of have the democratic view that the democracy is all powerful and the ruler should be subject to it, and we should have votes on whatever you want to have votes on and implement that policy. As a Republican view, or the Republic view, is that, well, we the people really means the individuals that are citizens of the United States, and we have certain rights given what the Constitution has guaranteed, and the state, the government, has only certain enumerated powers, and therefore we should not be voting away our individual rights to give the state more of these grandiose powers to re-engineer society the way democracy might indicate that they should.
Right, and the question really revolves around what is the power of the majority and what is the legitimacy of more majority rule. If you look at democracy as this sort of mass plebiscitary vote that can overrule any constitutional prescription, any constitutional right. For example, does the majority have a right to overrule an individual right that's in the Bill of Rights? That's something that this whole question of democracy really has never got around to addressing. And I think a lot of people just assume that whatever the majority wants to do, they have the power to do, and so therefore let it be done.
Free speech is something that's certainly under attack even today, even as clear as the First Amendment is, but on college campuses, there's very few where you can find free speech really being respected.
That's right, and certainly if you look at a lot of the movement in the direction of political correctness, it's all about a majority dictating to a minority, not just what they can say, but to a degree, what they can think. And we're moving more and more in that direction today. But I think it's important to point out that we cannot just rely on judicial interpretations of the First Amendment, just as an example, to protect our freedoms. We need to have structures in the political process that break apart that majority rule and mitigate the impact of majority rule on individual rights. And that's where this distinction between a democracy and a republic is really important. You were mentioning a moment ago the party structures that contribute to that Republican form of government, and that's certainly that's an area that I dealt with sort of unintentionally in the first book, The United States of Dysfunction, and it's sort of been growing on me the more and more I talk to people, because there's just this huge disconnect when you start talking about the role of political parties in a quote-unquote democratic process. Well, if the only thing that matters is majority rule, then why have a political party? Why have political parties at all? And the thing about political parties that's important, if you look at them historically, is that they're really vehicles and institutions and organizations that enable the people to govern themselves. And so I think it's important not to just contrast democracy with republic, because that's a little bit abstract, but even contrast democracy with self-government. Because when you start to compare democracy with self-government is government of, by, and for the people. Democracy starts to look not as good, because democracy is a majority selecting a leader. Self-government is the people governing themselves through a modality are a process of political institutions, and that's really the ideal that our country was founded on. It wasn't founded on this idea that we're just going to let people vote and we're going to do whatever the majority says. We don't have a constitution because we wanted the majority to just do whatever it wants. We have a constitution to protect individual rights, and that's really what we've gotten away from. But I think if you just talk about democracy, a lot of people don't realize what's missing from that concept and what we've gotten away from and what we've lost in this country.
So I think what I hear you saying is that you believe that the party structure in some way is a bulwark against runaway democracy. Are two political parties enough to stem the tide, or is there room for more?
Well, I think certainly if you look at it historically, there was a period of time when there was a lot more flexibility in our party system, and we can go into the details of that. But there was a period of time when we had a freer party system where political parties were more flexible and able to compete on the basis of merit than what we have today. And so if I think it's often the case that libertarians and conservatives talk about socialism in a negative sense, which is this idea that the government owns an industry or a company and sort of dictates how that industry or company is going to be run. That's sort of what we have today with political parties. We have political party socialism because the political parties are so regulated, and I would even say overregulated, that there's not a lot of room for people to develop parties along the lines of how they existed, say, from the 1830s to the 1890s. There was a lot of freedom there to innovate, for people to govern themselves and use those parties as a vehicle. And certainly if you look, starting in the 1890s is when we started to get away from that model. And that's also, it just so happens, when a lot of the voting started to taper off. 1896 was the peak of voting for all elections in the United States as a percentage of enfranchised voters. And as we've gotten away from that, fewer and fewer people vote with each election. It's a bit contradictory when you think about it in the context of democracy.
Right. And of course, there's a lot of criticism about the lack of people wanting to vote being directed to apathy. People just aren't willing to take the effort to vote or to learn about the candidates. And certainly I could be sympathetic to that, with the amount of regulation and involvement in every phase of everyone's life that the federal government has. It's very hard to keep up with all the policies and other things that a candidate might be espousing or be against. But this latest presidential primary seems to have removed some of the apathy, at least from at least it stirred up some of the negative resentment and issues, and I guess some of the positive too, in that it seems to be a more heated kind of a contest than at least I can remember in the recent past.
You have to ask, is the heat good for the country, though? And I'm not so sure that the answer is yes. And certainly you can go back to the discussions that the founding fathers were having when they created the Constitution, and this whole idea that they didn't want demagogues to be able to rise to power, and they created specific safeguards, things like the Electoral College or the indirect election of senators. And today we poo-poo these things as undemocratic or outmoded or unnecessary. And at the same time, we have a whole lot of problems in this country that we can't seem to figure out how to solve. We have a national deficit that continues to balloon, and we don't know how to fix these problems. We have an out-of-control monetary situation, and the issue that people are failing to see and certainly with all the excitement of the presidential race, it's glossed over this. How we fix these problems is by getting back to the structures and the Republican forms and the checks and balances that originally safeguarded our Constitution and preserved those ideals that a lot of people feel like are missing today.
Yeah, definitely. I think there is a widespread view of people of all political persuasions that Washington is broken. There's something very broken about the system, and it has turned into a very, for better word, nasty partisan name calling in order to try to, quote, fix it. I think there's a understanding on both the left and the right that that the system is rigged. I think it's of different perspective. I think people like Bernie Sanders thinks the system is rigged because of capitalism, and I think most of the thinking people on the right think the system is rigged because of government intervention, cronyism, and government favors. But there does seem to be a common theme that Washington is broken, and we need to do something. Well, what is that we need to do?
Right, and that's the big question. And I think the disturbing thing, and perhaps even the dangerous thing that we see today, is no discussion whatsoever of the role of the process and the role of the structure and the role of this political order that we've gotten away from. You know, all the discussion, at least in the popular media, goes is about eliminating the Electoral College or reducing the role of Congress or further marginalizing the political parties from the process and influence. And the reality is what we need to do is things like restoring the political parties to influence. We need to keep the Electoral College, but in this tidal wave of demands, ever increasing demands for majority rule and one person, one vote, we've forgotten about the decentralizing institutions and how those preserve the essential, what we really want to get out of our system.
I think we have a caller right now with a question for one of us. Go ahead, caller. Please let us know what your thoughts are.
Thank you guys for having me on the show.
Sure. Glad to have you.
Okay. I just want to say I'm really enjoying the show. I was a huge Ron Paul supporter, and I love libertarian views. I feel like we've gotten so far away of the Constitution. I feel like we're literally shredding it, what's going on in our society today. So to hear this dialogue is not only powerful, but it's almost life-changing. We need more people talking about these things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you have a question?
First thing, yes, I did. I wanted to go to the Constitution. When we're talking about the Constitution, one of the things that it was actually brought up during Donald Trump as well, does the Constitution apply to everyone? And from my research and study is that it does not. Is that correct?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
As far as when the original contract was drafted, it was originally for the 13 colonies.
Oh, that question may be a little outside of my realm of expertise. As far as I understand it, the Constitution is very much in effect and applies, today. There's, maybe some variations on that interpretation that I'm.
Not that anybody pays a whole lot of attention to it, but it is in effect.
That is the. What did the caller have any additional thoughts on that, or?
I did. I had one more thing,
Sure.
And another thing that was brought up is, does being born in America make you an American citizen? I mean, I use the analogy if someone was going to visit China and they lived in China and they had a baby in China, that does not mean that the baby is Chinese. So does being born in America make you an American citizen?
Again, probably not an area where I have a lot of. That's more of a constitutional law type of a question. Trying to think if there's a succinct
What's the
answer.
current ruling on that? If I went to China and fathered a child over there, would that child be an American citizen?
Yeah, it wouldn't be a Chinese
Yeah.
citizen. There,
It
to
would
my
have to
knowledge,
be an
there are
American
certain.
citizen, right?
It would have to. You still be because nationality would have to play a factor.
Okay, I think you've stumped the panel
I mean,
tonight.
one thing that I will say about that, which is unique, makes America unique in all the countries of the world, is that we're the only country where someone can come here and swear an oath to the Constitution. You don't have to be a certain ethnicity or a certain religion, and you can become an American citizen by assenting to certain ideals. And that's a very unique thing that America has, not just today to a degree. I mean, it's less and less as the world changes, but certainly when our Constitution was formed, you know, they were looking at also the Roman Republic or the Roman system where you know, in certain instances, military leaders were swearing their oath of allegiance to political leaders instead of to a constitution and a form of government. And this is one of the things that I think we overlook that makes America special, and why our Constitution is so important, is that it really gives us an ideal for people to assent to and gravitate to, and it's really the thing that makes us a nation, not just a unique nation, but it makes us a nation. And the more we get away from the Constitution, you know, there's a lot of people that say the Constitution doesn't matter, or we need to be
Right.
more like other countries. We need to have a Constitution more like them. No, I mean, our Constitution is really what makes us a nation. It's what
Absolutely.
makes us an independent country. And
Absolutely.
that's what we need to always remember and call to mind, even amidst some of these really heated political debates.
Absolutely. I
Okay,
agree.
thank
And
you.
I guess
Go
do I
ahead.
have time for one more?
Yeah,
Oh.
sure.
Okay, I guess my last one would be you guys gave such an in-depth history on the political, origins of the whole Democrat Republican system. Is there do you have more information that will expound upon the Constitution? Because when I research it, it says the Constitution was framed and adopted. Do we know where it was framed and adopted from? And is there any more in-depth history that would kind of lead us more into that as well?
Oh, we can certainly talk about that, and depends which direction we want to go, but we can talk about it in the context of this discussion. Certainly, I'll let David fire away with some questions in that direction.
Yeah, maybe we can weave that into the conversation as we go along.
Absolutely.
We got another caller holding, so thank you for calling in and appreciate your comments. Okay, caller, we have another caller on the line.
Yes, how you doing?
Hi.
Doing fine.
Okay, I would like to just ask certain questions here. For instance, like, and please don't take this the wrong way. I'm a Black American, and I really hate to say I'm a Black American because I just feel only to be an American. But I'm military, I'm retired military, and when like the Freedom say, we the people of the United States. Shouldn't that be only for Americans, which means that the Americans, citizens, will have that right to this Constitution, will have the right to all the freedoms and privileges that the Constitution offers for its citizens. And the contrast is, therefore, how can it be when foreigners come to this country, they learn our Constitution, which is a great document, yet they take free liberty of our Constitution, and for the average Americans, it seems like we the ones out of place, and the system is giving them all the rights to say what they want to say and to do what they want to do because they will quote the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights.
Right.
So, Okay, so the question that I have for you, and I also I know I'm covering a lot of areas, but for the Black Americans, man, I'm so thankful for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment of the Constitution. Now, with me understanding this, I'm all American. Everything of the Constitution belongs to me, and I accept it. And I thank the Republicans back in the days for passing these bills so I can have the rights that I have today. But I feel so betrayed. I feel like I'm being raped because as a citizen, no one should be able to come to this country and have more pull and more power than the citizen of the United States, and they're getting away with it. But yet, I can have a tail light burned out on my car, and I get pulled over and have to pay a penalty. So, can y'all please talk about some of these issues? And I really love your show, and I'm gonna turn on my TV now and listen to what you have to say. And by the way, I'm retired military, and I love this country. And there's no other place that I'd rather be, and I've been to a lot of places. Thank you.
I agree with that sentiment wholeheartedly.
Yeah, you're talking to two retired military people here.
Well, I'm not retired, but
well, we're not
I was
retired,
in for 5
but
years.
we're past military.
And yeah, no, I think having been in the military, it gives you a different perspective on things. Having been overseas and seeing how other systems work, it gives you a greater appreciation for our Constitution and the freedoms that we have and in the form of government that we have. And, I guess I'm trying to kind of formulate a way of addressing the caller's question, but I think that we have a lot of people in this country that are upset and fed up with the direction that the country is headed, and for a lot of different reasons. Feel like our system is getting trashed by the day, and I think part of what needs to happen, part of the awakening that needs to happen is people need to look around and just make sure that we all are doing the best that we can personally. And certainly when you look at a lot of the demands that are being made on our system today, and I'm talking about the structure of the system and the electoral process, and we can look at it even in the presidential nominating race today. We have all of these expectations of the candidates that when they get elected, they're going to do this, that, and the other thing that they promised us, and they're going to use their government power to do all those things. And where's the role of the people? Where do the people get to participate in that process past the point of casting their ballot on Election Day? The people don't have a role. And that's what we've gotten away from. The people need to have a role in that. They need to have a more active role selecting the nominees. We need to, and going back to the conversation that David and I were having a moment ago, we need to get back to this idea that the political parties are important, that participation in a political party, even though that's a very unpopular idea today, to get involved in a political party and make a difference that way. The political parties were created in the 1830s. We didn't really have them before that. They were created, centuries ago to facilitate government of, by, and for the people. And that's what really what we need to get back to. We need to get back to the basics, and we need to get away from this idea that just because somebody votes in an election, that is the end of their duty, or that is the ultimate in their participation in the system.
Yeah, and I think we have to remember that we are all basically a nation of immigrants. My grandparents came over from Germany in the early 20th century. And so I think the the divisive nature that's coming up in society about immigrants is because
It's driven by democracy. It's driven by demagogic appeals. I mean, when you really boil it down,
it is. It's driven by that, and it's also driven by the amount of regulation and interference in our everyday lives that the federal government is exerting. And the more power that you give the government, and then pretend that somehow or other it's a democratic power, the more the government winds up setting one group against another group, and we wind up thinking that other groups are taking advantage of us or getting something
yeah, there's always the other. But one thing specifically, though, with regard to this whole immigration question, and in particular, I think one of the callers' concerns was with, are these immigrants that are coming in, are they being assimilated to the ideals that our country was founded on? And I think if you approach the question that way, that's certainly a concern. You know, are they being brought up to believe that our Constitution is the greatest system in the world? Or, you know, or do they not believe those things and they're becoming citizens anyway with the right to vote? You know, that's certainly a valid question. Are they? But then you have to also ask, are ordinary American citizens being brought up to appreciate the Constitution?
Exactly.
Because I know a lot of immigrants who have come over here, they're first-generation Americans, and they know more about the Constitution than a lot of original, you know, people that were born and raised here. And not only do they know more about it, but they have a greater appreciation for it than people who were raised here.
We got to get away from the fact that we're creating a system where people want to vote for the person that will give them the most stuff, you know, as opposed to not being aware of what the overall structure and what freedom and liberty and what self-responsibility takes in.
Well,
thank you for calling. We got another caller coming in. If we can move on, if we could. Thank you very much for your call. Yes,
Hello?
sir or ma'am. Yes, we have a. Go ahead.
Sir, yes. My name is Dimitri. I'm an immigrant to this country. I spent almost 21 years in the Army as an enlisted man. What is wrong with this country is that we allowed the Democrats to create a royal family, the same way that Trump has been saying truths, but the way he has been saying have not been the proper way to say. They need to close the border. No country in the world allowed immigrants to cross the border and they get all they get here, all the benefits. And the other thing, too, this country, when I came to this country, you had to learn English. Today, I live in a city where I could be in Latin America. Spanish is so prevalent that incredibly it's the number one language. It used to be a term American. That has been lost. I do not like the Democrats. I don't like Hillary because she wants some more of what we've been getting from Obama. Nothing, other than dividing the country.
Well, I want to address two of the callers' points. First, on the point of, and it kind of ties in with what I was saying a moment ago about the folks that are coming in. Are they being, are they, you know, do they have the right ideals? Do they believe in the Constitution? I think in a lot of cases that's true. If you look at the flip side of it, though, with a lot of the political correctness that comes out of this identity politics that is really driven by democracy, right? Because when you have a democracy and all the votes are just millions of voters, you tend to have these identity blocks that emerge and preferred groups that emerge. And now all of a sudden, you can't tell this group that, well, you need to learn English if you want to live here. We don't want to hurt your feelings, so we're not gonna require that. We're not gonna ask that of you. And yes, I think that is a growing problem. When you start talking about some of the dynasticism within national politics, again, that is a huge problem. But if you look at the root cause of that and how we got to a situation where we now have a potential nominee or a presumptive nominee who has in effect already served in the White House for 16 years, depending on how you want to count it. That is the effects of democracy pushed to an extreme. That is a breakdown of Republican principles and the Republican form of government at an extreme. This election that we have this year is unlike any election that we've ever had in our history. And I know a lot of politicians say that, but I want to put a more technical flavor on that statement, which is this is the first election that is being decided 100% by the results of direct primary elections for the presidency. And the results are not what people want them to be. They're not what the result is not what people want it to be. The process people are upset with. They do not like the result. And the thing that really disturbs me is not only the result that we're going to get, but how people are going to push the process further in the direction that we've already gone. And they're going to want to even eliminate more of the structures, more of the bulwarks that are actually holding our system together. I predict that in the next 4 years, we're going to come very close to abolishing the Electoral College. We're going to come very close to adopting a national primary system, which is only going to perpetuate things like we see in this election, where wealth and political dynasty absolutely control the process, and there are no options for someone that actually wants to advocate in the interests of ordinary people to get elected. That's what we're seeing right now.
Seems to me that the path that you calculate we're on is basically that name recognition becomes a substitute for democracy.
That's dynasty.
Yeah.
Name recognition, ability to raise money. That's
what democracy has become.
That's what democracy is.
And
not what we think it is, but what it is in effect. You have to distinguish the ideal from what it is in effect.
Okay.
And that's where people kind of get confused, I think.
And as you talked about in the U.S. of dysfunction, can you encapsulate for our listeners in 30 seconds or less what your solution to that problem is?
Well, I don't like encapsulating the solution that way, because the solution in a nutshell is to move toward a representative system where voters are not directly electing the candidate in the primary, but rather electing a representative to then go on and choose the candidate through a national convention. You know, we talk about national conventions and brokered conventions. There's no chance in the world that any national convention today is going to select the nominee. The media speculates about it every 4 years. We've seen the speculation this year. It could never happen the way the system works. And the thing that's dangerous about that is that you get away from any kind of check in the system that allows ordinary people to put a brake on where we're headed. There are no brakes left in our system. There are no more checks and balances. We're just a train running down the tracks. And I think a lot of people are increasingly uncomfortable with that, but they can't quite put the nail on the head as far as why they're uncomfortable with it. They can't articulate it. It's sort of a gut level feeling that people have about where we are and where we're headed.
Yeah, and I think the point you brought out in your earlier book was people cannot expect to learn much about a national candidate through the manipulated,
media,
choreographed media
ads,
appearances.
mail.
But you can know something about a representative that you have from your geographical area who is going to be a delegate to a convention that's going to choose the candidate. And so you can hold somebody accountable when your ideas are not brought forth or supported at the convention. You know who is supposed to be supporting them. You have no influence whatsoever with a direct primary candidate who's already, for instance, won the Texas.
They hire a consultant and you have no real say in it, as opposed to the representative system where you're deliberating, there's trust, there's intimacy, there's checks and balances. One other thing that I wanted to say, though, about the solution, because you asked me to say the solution in a nutshell. Part of the solution, quite honestly, is the discussion that we're having tonight, which is not only drawing this distinction between democracy in a republic, but also increasing the acceptance for the idea of a republic, which we've gotten away from. And not only increasing the acceptance, but making a republic the preferred option between those two alternatives. Because most people today, if you ask them does a proposal like this sound good where we have representatives choosing our nominees? The first thing that they would say, and it comes out in a variety of ways, but the first objection, and it's a universal objection, is that's undemocratic. Well, maybe we shouldn't be a democracy. Maybe we should be a republic instead, with all the implications that that has for self-government. And get away from this idea, this abstract idea of democracy, and get back to the reality of how does the process work? Do we have government of, by, and for the people? Or are we gravitating into a dynasty and a monarchy, which I think a lot of people feel is where we're drifted today?
Yeah, that was brings back Ben Franklin's quote when the Constitutional Convention, someone came out and asked him what kind of a government that the founders had created. Was it a monarchy or a republic? And his answer, of course, was, well, it's a republic if you can keep it. And notice he didn't say, is it a republic or a democracy? He said, is it a republic or a monarchy? And he obviously realized that a republic was going to be much harder to keep than a democracy because it required people to be informed about the structure and their participation and their responsibilities.
It requires people to be informed about the structure.
Well, what do you think, we have a few minutes left to talk about, what do you think about potential changes to the U.S. Constitution that would bolster and support your ideas about how to return our government to the people and get more honest participation and diffuse the power structure? Are there things that can be changed? Of course, you're probably aware that Governor Abbott has introduced something called the Texas Plan, where he has 7 or 8 different amendments that he is proposing be made to the U.S. Constitution. Is that a fertile ground for trying to get us back on track to the issue of republics and self-government?
So I think that the whole discussion around the Constitution is fruitful, but I think we have to qualify that a little bit. And I think we can't overinvest our hopes in this idea that changing the text of the Constitution is going to have a meaningful impact. And part of the reason is because we certainly have a Constitution, we have a Commerce Clause, we have a 10th Amendment, but the way that all these things are interpreted today is in favor of centralized authority and increasing overreach of the federal government. So how do you get back to something that makes sense? And it's very interesting if you read the Constitution very carefully at some of the things that the Constitution refers to but does not actually include. And I'll give 2 big examples, and there's a lot of other smaller examples that I talk about in the United States of dysfunction. But one of the big examples is the Constitution gives state legislatures all the power in the world to determine how they want to appoint electors to the Electoral College. And a lot of people say, well, we vote for the president, and based on that vote, the electors are chosen. The process is actually a lot more nuanced than that, and it changes state by state. It's changed a lot in the history of our country. In fact, in the first several elections, a number of the electors from the different states were chosen by state legislatures, because that's how the legislatures decided that they wanted to do it. And obviously we've gotten away from that more to an electoral process. But that's just one example of a structure that the Constitution says needs to be there, but it doesn't actually provide. Now, another area which we've referenced and talked about quite a bit in this conversation has to do with the political parties, and in particular the role of political parties in selecting the presidential nominees. Where does that come from? That comes from the 12th Amendment, which was passed in 1803. there's a long story about why we ended up with the 12th Amendment. But if you really boil down to why we have it and the effect that it has, it empowers political parties to play a role in selecting the national presidential nominees, and of course, in various ways led to the process that we have today, although I think that the process that we have today, a lot of people would agree, is not so much by design, but by default, and it's something that we'd like to get away from.
And so the issue of giving more power to the political parties, you do not see that as being a partisan divisiveness that is going to be introduced in the country. You're going to see that as a more positive devolution of power away from aggrandizement of more power in Washington and national elections.
It would have a greater effect in empowering ordinary people and decentralizing power in this country than it would with getting bad actors more power. It would have the effect of giving ordinary people more power and reducing the power of the central government.
It gets power closer to the people
Absolutely.
themselves, right?
Yep.
And they get to have more of a personal influence over the outcome of political elections.
That's exactly right. And it's not just theoretical. You can look at it historically, how our system developed, the effects that it had, and you can see this demonstrated in American history.
Okay, well, we'll all be anxiously awaiting your new book. When do you presume that's going to be ready? I know you're working on it now.
Well, God willing, it'll be later this year, but
And the name of it is?
Reframing the American Republic.
Okay, and it's going to encapsulate a lot of what we've been talking about
Absolutely.
here.
Reframing, not just reframing the debate, but hopefully reframing the structure of the system.
Okay. Do you think the American experiment is going to survive this next presidential election long enough for people to be able to view, understand, and digest your critique of what's going on?
Well, I'm optimistic, and that's why I'm writing the book. So.
Okay. Well, I don't know what else to say. Do you have any other political projects on your table right now other than finishing your book? Or you have any other plans to run for public office like you did for City Council District C, I guess? Or?
Not at this time. You know, I've become sort of obsessed with this idea of how do we restore the Republican character of our country, and how do we sort of, how do I communicate that message to people effectively and get people excited about it? So that's really my main focus at this point. And you know, if something like that happens later on, I suppose that'll be fine, but it's certainly not my focus right now.
Okay. Well, Carl, thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's always a fruitful and pleasant conversation that we have on public affairs, public access. I certainly want to thank HMS TV for giving us that opportunity to kind of discuss some of these more fundamental concepts about our government and public policy. And so we look forward to maybe when your book is published, we can do a return engagement and talk a little bit more about how that will affect the political outcomes. And we'll probably have a presidential election that we could comment on as well.
Right, yeah.
Thank you again, Carl.
Thank you for having me on, David.